Today we'll dive into a dramatic development in the Baltic region. Denmark strikes back Russia's Baltic Sea access shut down. We'll explore how this unfolded, why it matters, and what it means for geopolitics in Northern Europe and beyond. This all begins with the changing balance of power in the Baltic Sea region. For years, Russia's Baltic fleet in Kaliningrad and naval bases along its coast had relatively free access to the Baltic and beyond. Russia counted on transit through the Kattegat and the Sound to move ships into the North Sea and Atlantic, as well as to resupply and reposition vessels. But recently, Denmark has taken decisive steps to challenge and effectively sever those access routes, altering the maritime dynamics dramatically. To understand what's at stake, first consider Denmark's geographic leverage. Denmark controls the narrow straits that connect the Baltic Sea to the North Sea, the Danish Straits, including the Øresund, the Sound, the Great Belt, and the Little Belt. Ships departing east from Denmark's North Sea waters toward the Baltic must pass through these chokepoints. Historically, the transit rights for warships have been governed by treaties like the Copenhagen Convention and later agreements. Neutral nations often had obligations to maintain freedom of navigation, but wartime and security contexts can shift those norms. In recent months, Denmark has invoked its rights and strategic position to deny or limit Russian naval passage through the Danish Straits. This is what I refer to when I say Denmark is striking back. It's asserting authority to deny Russia's naval ambitions in the Baltic. The consequences are profound. First, Russia's Baltic fleet is significantly constrained. Without access through the Danish Straits, Russian vessels are essentially trapped in the Baltic, unable to move through to the Atlantic or redeploy to other theaters. That reduces their operational reach, flexibility, and strategic value. Russia can no longer freely send reinforcements, extra supplies, or quickly reposition their navy to respond to crises elsewhere. Second, Denmark's move reshapes deterrence and power projection in the Baltic region. NATO and Baltic states have long worried about Russia's ability to pressure countries like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania via both sea and land. By locking Russia in, Denmark helps tilt the naval balance in favor of NATO. Russia's ability to threaten sea lanes, blockade ports, or interdict supply routes becomes more limited. Third, this shift has ripple effects for alliances and security policy. Denmark's bold step signals greater assertiveness in maritime defense. It may inspire other Baltic littoral states to adopt similar stances or support Allied naval operations more robustly. NATO might increase naval presence in the region, reinforcing collective security. Russia, feeling constrained, may pivot to asymmetric measures, submarine warfare, mines, coastal missile batteries, to compensate. But how did Denmark manage this legally and politically? It's not a simple decree. The Danish government framed the decision in terms of national security and alliance commitments. They argued that Russian warships transiting to global theaters posed unacceptable risks, given ongoing conflicts and heightened tensions. Denmark's parliament backed more flexible interpretation of its transit obligations. Some legal experts debated whether this is consistent with international law, particularly the Montreux Convention-style principles or the law of the sea. But in crises, nations often press their claims hard. Russia, unsurprisingly, responded with protests, diplomatic condemnation, and warnings. Moscow claimed Denmark was violating historic maritime freedoms and acting provocatively. Russian Naval Command sought alternative routes or pressure through other maritime neighbors, but ultimate options are limited. Bypassing Denmark would require going around Norway or via Arctic routes, which are costly, illicit, or seasonal. Let's consider what Russia might try to do. One option is to claim exceptions, emergency passage, humanitarian or logistical needs, or invoking rights under treaties. Russia might argue that Denmark's closure is overreach and contravenes customary passage rights. It might also seek to engage third parties, appealing to other states or international courts. Yet, Denmark and NATO are likely prepared for that legal and diplomatic push. Russia could also resort to force or harassment, send ships up to the Danish Straits, test rules, provoke incidents. But Denmark and its allies would probably respond with show-off, force naval deployments, air patrols, or allied maritime denial measures. In either case, this Danish move forces Russia to rethink Baltic strategy. The Baltic fleet's main task now becomes defensive, protecting Kaliningrad, securing supply lines within the Baltic, and deterring intrusion. Russia may invest more heavily in Kaliningrad's fortifications, shore-based missile systems, anti-ship batteries, fast attack craft, and submarines. They'll rely more on missile and rocket forces than surface fleets. Their ability to project power beyond the Baltic will be impaired. For European security, Denmark's action reinforces the idea that geography remains critical. Control of chokepoints gives smaller states outsized influence in conflict, just as control of straits in the Pacific or Suez or Bosporus matter. Here, Denmark is using its geography decisively. It also highlights that maritime chokepoints are not just economic, but strategic assets. Let's turn to the maritime balance of forces in the Baltic. NATO has steadily increased presence. Sweden and Finland's NATO membership enhanced joint exercises, more allied ships rotating through Baltic ports. These steps were partly motivated by Russian aggression in Ukraine and concerns over Baltic defense. With Russia's fleet now hemmed in, Allied naval forces can assert dominance in the Baltic, project presence, escort merchant convoys, and deter coercive moves. This strengthens NATO's posture and enhances reassurance to Baltic allies. Also, Denmark's move may encourage development of maritime infrastructure in Baltic states. For instance, ports capable of hosting Allied ships, submarine bases, resupply and repair facilities. The Baltic littoral might become more self-sufficient militarily. Denmark, Germany, Poland, and the Baltic nations could coordinate sea denial zones or minefields or maritime control choke points. Combined with air and missile defenses, the region could become a much tougher area for Russia to challenge. We should also view potential Russian countermeasures beyond naval. Russia could escalate its asymmetric warfare, underwater drones, mines, sabotage of undersea cables, cyber attacks on port infrastructure, long-range missile strikes on coastal facilities. Russia's submarines and small attack craft may attempt clandestine passages between islands or through less monitored waterways. Denmark and alliance navies will need strong ASW anti-submarine warfare, mine countermeasures, surveillance, and response capability. Another dimension is the diplomatic and economic pressure. Russia might retaliate with sanctions, restrictions on energy or overflight rights, or trade disruptions. It may lobby neighboring countries like Sweden, Norway, or Germany to challenge Denmark's move. The legitimacy battle will be fought in UN maritime bodies, the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, or security forums. Denmark must be ready with legal arguments that exceptional security conditions justify limitations on warship passage, especially when one party is in active conflict. This scenario also forces us to revisit the notion of maritime chokepoint diplomacy. Smaller states with strategic location can exercise leverage beyond their size. Denmark, though relatively small, commands transit into one of Europe's central seas. That power is proving decisive. Other strait-controlling states, Turkey, Panama, Singapore, have long wielded influence. Here Denmark is showing it in a defense context. From a Russian domestic perspective, this is a blow to prestige and strategic planning. The Baltic Fleet has been part of Russia's image of naval strength. If it's bottled up, unable to operate globally, it undermines messaging about Russian naval reach. The leadership may face pressure to adapt, revamp doctrine, or shift resources to other fleets like the Northern or Pacific. But that rebalancing costs time and money. What about risk and escalation? This move by Denmark is bold and carries danger. Russia might see it as an aggressive act and respond with escalation. A misstep at sea, accidental collision, or standoff in contested waters could spark crises. Denmark and NATO must manage rules of engagement, communication channels, and deconfliction. There's always a danger of miscalculation, especially with submarines or fast attack vessels darting through narrow waters. Still, the strategic benefits seem to outweigh the risks. The Baltic becomes less of a Russian sphere of influence and more of a NATO-dominated sea. Baltic littoral states gain security. Denmark cements its role as a critical guardian of Northern European maritime security. Russia loses flexibility and influence in a vital theater. Let's imagine some near-term developments. Russia might attempt to challenge Denmark's embargo by pushing a flotilla through the Straits, accompanied by diplomatic threats, air cover, electronic warfare. Denmark and NATO would likely respond by mobilizing their own naval assets, frigates, patrol boats, mine countermeasure vessels, air patrols, submarines. In a tense standoff, rules of engagement, warning shots, or interference could occur. But unless Russia is willing to risk a major clash, it may back down in the face of unified NATO response. Alternatively, Russia could appeal to archipelago route, surround Norway's coast, or via Finland's waters, though constrained to reposition some naval assets. But those routes are longer, riskier, and less well supplied. Russia might also shift to using its northern fleet more aggressively, sending ships around Svalbard or through Arctic routes when ice allows. But that takes time and is seasonally limited. Over months and years, Denmark and allies may formalize policies on closure of transit rights in wartime, update treaties, and bolster surveillance and interdiction capabilities in straits. They may build permanent naval infrastructure, radar installations, and underwater monitoring in the Danish Straits zones. This would effectively anchor Russia's Baltic fleet in place for the long haul. Let's examine some counterarguments and caveats. One is that closing straits could be seen as aggressive or destabilizing, prompting wider escalation. Allies may worry about precedent. If Denmark can deny passage, could other states do so in future conflicts? It raises questions of international maritime norms. Denmark must balance deterrence and legal legitimacy. Also, closure could affect neutral or allied transit, allied navies, or third-party nations that need to move through the straits must be accommodated or exempted. Denmark has to calibrate rules to avoid collateral economic or diplomatic fallout. Another caveat: Russia may find legal loopholes or exploit ambiguity. They may argue that innocent passage rights survive even during conflicts, or that Denmark's actions violate customary international law. If they bring cases to international tribunals, Denmark must have a robust legal foundation and supportive allies. There is also a possibility of covert Russian operations, submarines, or unmarked vessels attempting clandestine transit. Denmark must be vigilant, but in the balance, Denmark's decision forces Russia's hand. The era when Russia could roam the Baltic and extend power outward is arguably over, at least for now. The Baltic has become more controlled and contested. The strategic map is changing. In conclusion, Denmark strikes back Russia's Baltic Sea access shutdown, captures a pivotal moment in Northern European security. Denmark, by leveraging its geography and sovereignty, has effectively bottled up Russia's Baltic naval mobility. That constrains Russia's strategic options, enhances NATO's dominance in the Baltic, reassures Baltic allies, and reshapes naval strategy in Europe. The Russian response, whether diplomatic, legal, asymmetric, or military, will define the next phase of Baltic security. But for now, Denmark's move is a bold assertion of maritime power and strategic denial.